This video is brought to you by Project FoundEd. Project FoundEd is a community of edtech founders that aim to make the edtech industry easier to navigate through collective voice and data. Learn more at projectfounded.org. Welcome to this session of edTech Recharge Studio. I'm Dr. Kripa Sundar, founder and lead consultant at edTech Recharge. In this video, I'd like to share with you some thoughts and insights into pilots and data. As an edtech company, you've often heard these words before. But what does it really mean, and how does it matter for you? Specifically, in this video, we're going to look at a couple of topics. We'll start with looking at the difference between pilots and trials. We'll look into what is your reason, or the importance of understanding why you're running a pilot or trial, and how that might even impact the size and duration of your pilot and trial. So much talk about pilots, but we will also look at what data should we be collecting and how do you prepare for a successful pilot. For the purposes of this video, and to make it a little easier for us to think through the idea of a pilot, we're going to focus more on products that sell to schools or universities. The same concepts can be applied when you are selling direct to customers, when it's a B2C model or a B2B2C model. The terms pilot and trial are often used interchangeably. A common reason for that to happen is that at the end of both, there could be the opportunity for conversion into paid customers, or what we call a timed purchase. For example, we subscribe to a streaming service, avail for a 1-week free trial, and then either we get charged or we have to disconnect before then. Similarly, when offering your edtech product to your target customers, you need to be aware of whether it's a trial or a pilot. A trial means you're giving your customers, your target customers, free access to your tool, similar to the streaming device, and asking them to convert at the end of that trial period. A pilot, on the other hand, is a lot more engaged. It's a lot more intensive because in exchange for the free use of the product, you will be collecting data. So it's not really free for the schools. There's just no monetary cost involved. Which of this should you be offering, a trial or a pilot? There is, of course, no compulsion that you have to offer one of the two. But organizing your priorities, especially as a lean startup, is going to be helpful. My favorite way to do that, and my recommendation, is to decide on what's your goal. Why are you offering free access to your tool? Is it to build your customer base? Is it to collect anecdotes or testimonials for your marketing materials? Or is it for you to test for usability and feasibility and or efficacy? You could also collect marketing information by offering a free trial, depending on how much content you want. If it's just feedback or a testimonial, that might be possible with a free trial. On the other hand, if you are looking to build user case studies of how teachers, for example, are using your product in the classroom, or if you are trying to work with a nonprofit organization to understand how your tool is helping them communicate with their membership in a more robust manner, those more organized units of marketing material is going to be easier to achieve with a pilot. However, those pilots typically do not take very long. You could put one together pretty quickly once you identify what kind of material you want for your marketing needs. You could run a fairly short pilot duration, maybe a month. And the size of your pilot, meaning how many people you engage, could vary really depending on the size of your company. If you're just starting out and you have your baseline MVP, maybe you just work with 3 to 5 teachers. Collect some user case studies. If you have worked on your product a little more and it's V2 or you have more traction, you might want to collect from more teachers. Simply because now you can afford it, one, but also providing that diversity of experiences could be really enlightening for you as a company, but also for potential customers. If you are scaling your customer base, don't be afraid to dream big. Go beyond teachers and start focusing on classrooms. To clarify, when I say use case scenarios, I'm merely referring to the description of how a teacher is using it, or pulling together examples of different ways your product's being used. On the other hand, if you are looking to run a pilot to collect evidence towards your usability or feasibility, you would want a longer pilot program, let's say 2 to 3 months. And you want to spend a little more intentional time making sure all your preparations are in place. When executing a pilot with the intention of collecting evidence, especially if it's low-key, such as usability and feasibility studies, you want to give yourself at least a month of prep time. During that time, we're going to look up what surveys we want to collect. We're going to think through our key questions. We're going to run interviews and want a protocol in place to ensure that we are collecting all the information that we want to satisfy the goals of our pilot. Again, a usability study is hopefully an ongoing endeavor on your end. How many classrooms that you take for a usability or feasibility study can depend on the stage of product that you're at. Often at this stage, you want to try to collect classrooms and not just teachers. The difference being when we say we are working with a classroom, we're also authorized and we've received all the permissions necessary to collect information about or from students, as well as the teachers. If you're just starting out, you could just work with 1 or 2 classrooms. If you have more traction, 3 or more classrooms are great. And then comes efficacy studies. Now, efficacy studies is when we're collecting evidence in a systematic and rigorous manner to ascertain whether your product is effective to achieve the outcomes intended for a specific population. A feasibility study, defined by some researchers, also borders on similar lines, but at a much lesser stakes. Right? In a feasibility level, we're just trying to ensure that within those 2 to 3 classrooms that we have, let's say we're seeing an increase in reading scores, or that we've seen an increase in writing quality, or we see an increase in time spent practicing math. On the other hand, with an efficacy study, the schools that you choose, the number of students that you have, and perhaps even the demographics of students or schools or districts that you're going to recruit into your product's efficacy study will need to be thought out and done in a more scientific manner. For this purpose, if you're planning towards an efficacy study, make sure that you give yourself 3 to 6 months of lead time to prep. And this is, of course, assuming you have a researcher on board who is able to carry out your efficacy study already. The study itself can be anywhere from 6 months and beyond. Often a reason for this is to ensure that we've collected sufficient data during that study period to guarantee to the extent possible that your product is effective. If you are just launching out with your minimum viable product, you are unlikely going to have either the traction, the product, or the budget to be able to run an efficacy study. Instead, watch our video on impact and efficacy to learn of other options available for you to demonstrate your plausible efficacy. Now, if you are a product with preliminary traction and you feel fairly certain that your product is not going to change substantially in the next, let's say, 6 months or so, and you have partnerships in place where you're able to recruit 300 to 400 students at a minimum, you might be ready for an efficacy study. Now remember that all of this that I'm sharing are approximate guidelines, and they may vary based on your product, your stage, and the amount of customer traction you have, as well as your goals. To recap, understanding and deciding on why you are offering a pilot or a trial can save you a significant amount of heartache and budgets. If you were looking to just increase your customer base, you could very well just offer a free trial. If you're looking for marketing material, you could offer them a free trial with a quick survey at the end, or run a really short, quick pilot to collect more in-depth use case scenarios and more lived experiences that you can showcase. On the other hand, if you are wanting to run a pilot towards getting usability or feasibility evidence, there is a little more prep work involved and the duration can lead up to 3 months. Versus when you're running a pilot for an efficacy study, we want to be engaging with the researchers far ahead of that decision of which districts are going to sign up for the pilot. And when speaking of knowing your why for your pilot, it's also important to set specific goals, right? Set specific goals for you as a company, but also make sure that your definition of success syncs with what the customer thinks is success. This is going to require some preliminary groundwork by you as the company to identify how do customers define success for your product. Once we have those goals set and we know what we're looking for, the next step for us is often to collect informed consent and assent, and if required, complete an institutional review board application and get our permissions in place, especially when we're dealing with student data. Now, even if you have a researcher on your team handling your pilot implementation and data collection, you really want to ascertain that you have a couple of your ducks in a row before you go to that step. For example, if your company already has, let's say, a customer chat bot or a phone option or an email option, you want to ensure that these are actually available and are going to provide useful information. What are the ways that a user who's experiencing a problem can contact you and let you know this isn't working, or how do I do this? Make sure that information is available, useful, and shared with the potential user base. A second thing is, let's say you don't have that set up yet because you're just testing your basic product. In that instance, feel welcome to open up a channel for communication, even if it is only for the duration of the pilot. One of the goals of your pilot is to collect data. You want to be able to allow users to interact with you. It can be stressful, but it's all valuable data on what's working, what's not, what are your frequently asked questions. Another piece is to think through your onboarding process. Even if you have a researcher on board working with the usability and feasibility aspects, they are most likely going to help you understand what is working, what is not. But even before they get to that stage, your product must be ready for use. This is easier if you're just working, let's say, with a teacher, and all they need is a login and a password. On the other hand, if now they need to invite students onto your platform to use your product, you need to ensure that you have the logistical pieces in place. How are the students going to log on? Is there going to be a QR code? Is there a group bulk sign-on option for the students? How can you make the teacher's job of using your product easier? This is something that you must have some baseline for which researchers can then collect data and let you know if that's good enough, too much, too little, whatever the case might be. But you need to make sure that there is onboarding documentation. Also remember that if you are working with a special population, whether they are children or another sensitive population, you need to make sure that you're having some sort of a document or presentation or some sort of information to allow their caregivers to ascertain if they even want their student or person to engage with your product. This might require you to kind of showcase what's the goal of the pilot. What kind of data are you going to be using? How is that data going to be stored? And to how much is that person going to have to share? Sharing that kind of information then allows for that kind of informed consent and assent, and can also allay your concerns about, hey, what if participants don't sign up? And that is often a very real concern. Now, let's say you have all of this set up, right? You have all your ducks in a row. One thing that I've often noticed folks sometimes drop is they collect all of this data and they stop tracking it. As a pilot is going, if it's an efficacy study, you shouldn't touch your product at all. Just don't touch your product till the pilot is done, else our results are going to be a little, murky, I guess. If you're running a usability and feasibility study, pilot test even your pilot with just one or two teachers and track responses closely. Are there those small one or two things that quick tweaks could help for a more seamless experience? You may or may not want to change the product during the duration of the pilot, especially if it's a usability or feasibility study. Since it's fairly short and that's the whole goal, it will help you kind of start thinking ahead to maybe it raises additional questions, or maybe you need to rethink your budget or timelines for the release. In other cases, you might see that your pilot's going exceedingly well and want to consider the idea of a timed purchase or start conversations with that district and engaging them more effectively for that kind of conversion to happen. Let's start with the easy one. How do we collect data? The data collection methods across the different pilot goals are fairly consistent. You will have surveys, you will have interviews, you might even look at your product usage and learning data from the back end, from the front end, student responses, but you could also ask them for additional audio-video recordings or have them write through a journal or maybe share some other documentation. Focusing on the lowest hanging fruit of running a pilot for marketing, you should be collecting demographic information to the extent that you're allowed. You want to document the context of use and the use case of your product. You want to document how long the teacher used it, and also if there were favorable impressions of that product. Context of use can refer to, is it a low-income school? Was it a diverse classroom? It could also refer to the time, right? Was it during COVID? Was it in a blended setup? Was it in an in-person setup? Was it in a completely online setup? A lot of this information is going to resonate even if you're running a product trial for, let's say, a workforce environment. What kind of company was that space? What kind of other programs do they have in place? Are they using your product as the primary source? Is it a supplemental tool? Getting information on both your tool, but also importantly, how, when, and for how long your users use your product is going to form the bulk of your information. This kind of data is often collected just at the end of that pilot. Common uses of this data, once analyzed, is to showcase testimonials or write up use cases or examples to showcase with other potential users. Often when people think of running a pilot, they are thinking from the aspects of usability or feasibility. In addition to the kind of information you'd be collecting for your marketing needs, you will also want to collect specific targeted information. What worked? What didn't? What are some features that are on your wish list that you want to collect some preliminary feedback on? And or what are some features that your customers feel might make this easier for them to use? You also want to record the change in your intended outcome. Has the teacher seen a growth? Have scores actually changed? But you also want to record how they are interacting with the product and how they're experiencing the product as a whole. This kind of information is likely going to have more data being collected, especially if we're looking at feasibility. You want to collect data at the beginning as well as at the end. And that data could often be collected as surveys. You will also have interviews at the end to kind of debrief and or clarify responses from surveys, but you will also be monitoring ongoing product usage and learning data. Remember that a usability or feasibility pilot can be anywhere from a month to 3 months long, so monitoring data will make sure that your pilot is still alive and active and usage hasn't dropped. Data collected from a usability and feasibility study is often used for internal improvements to your product design, to your process, to your onboarding, to your support, or even very simply, the visual design of your product. However, this information could also be used to craft case studies if successful, or even a simple white paper showcasing what you've learned. When running a pilot for an efficacy study, there will be a lot more information we collect. Think about this section of the video being more cumulative. As the intensity of your goal increases, the more data you want to collect. In addition to the information that you have for marketing, especially the context of implementation, you also want to consider the findings you had from your usability and feasibility studies. What were some known issues? And not just from previous implementations or previous pilots, but in your current efficacy study. What were some known issues? Let's say the server crashed one day and you couldn't collect data that day. Or policies changed and your teacher couldn't access the product until 6 weeks into the pilot duration. Understanding the context of implementation, the lived experiences through that period of efficacy study is going to help your researcher and you as a company understand the gravity of your findings. Most critical for an efficacy study is to assess the change in intended outcomes. This is often why at edTech Recharge, we recommend companies to always start with defining their impact, defining what needs to be measured. Data collection tools for efficacy studies is going to be pretty similar with surveys both at the start and end of the pilot, interviews at the end, occasionally required but strongly recommended, and ongoing learning data. You'll note that there isn't much of a difference in perhaps the method in which a usability or efficacy study is conducted in terms of data collection, but there is a difference when it comes to the kind of questions we're asking, the extent of rigor that we implement, the duration, as well as the extent to which we go into the details and the volume of data that we collect for the two. So though they might sound very similar, they're actually pretty different. Findings from an efficacy study could help you with internal improvements, but is more often just presented as evidence of efficacy when requested by schools and districts. And that's what I have for you in this session on pilot and data. We've talked on a lot of pieces, and to recap, it will always start with knowing why you want to do this, which will determine the how, the when, the what data we collect, and what do we do with it. All starts with your why. And we at edTech Recharge are always happy to help you as you need, when you need it. Contact us anytime.